Cheers.
Cheers.
Nikil, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Excited to be here.
Appreciate you coming by. I think we've been wanting to do this for a while, and we're going to get into the core truths and unfiltered perspectives on our product experiences, and excited for you to be my first guest. So maybe just talk us through a little bit about your career arc, how you got to where you got to now, and then we'll dive into kind of some perspectives that you have along the way.
Yeah. So started at Amazon, as you know, and even when joining there, was really motivated by the growth opportunity, but also just being able to learn. And I think learning has always been the thing that has motivated me to move to each new place. And so with Amazon, you're surrounded by so many smart people. And I had to predict that a little bit. But once I got there, I realized that very quickly. And over that time, got a chance to learn from some of the best people, both in product, but also across the board. And so ultimately, being in that big company, I did want to accelerate that learning by going smaller. And that's kind of been my thread throughout my career. Um, I went to WeWork, which was high growth. And then I got a chance to work at an even smaller startup in the education tech space at Newzella. And then after that, took some time off and really wanted to figure out what do I want to do next. And ultimately decided to go to an even smaller startup, a Jackpocket. Last year, we got acquired by DraftKings. And so it's been an incredible journey, I would say. I almost knew I could stay at Amazon forever in a sense of there wasn't anything glaringly bad. It's actually a great company. It's a great product role. There are plenty of opportunities that you can easily move across teams. But I knew that for myself and going back to that learning and that growth, I wanted to be able to do something else and try something else. And I think some of the elements of having that autonomy at a large company is hard. You own a very defined space, right? And there's some people that love that defined process and love that defined space. There's elements that I missed of that, when you go to a startup, but I think ultimately I wanted to go and see what does that look like at other places. After you leave, you start to appreciate things a little bit more, even some of the things you didn't even realize. So I definitely have some of those elements from Amazon, which I'm curious if you feel that.
Yeah, I think for me is like very similar. Wanted to try something new. Grass is always greener.
Yeah.
Someone actually told me recently that there's always brown grass everywhere, which is their perspective of saying, well, it's not necessarily the grass is greener, it's that you're going to have bad patches kind of regardless of where you are. So not every company is perfect. For me, I wanted to build something new. I think Amazon, you can do that. It's just the arc to kind of get from inception to launch is just a little bit longer, given Amazon scale. There's more stakeholders involved. There's more nuances that you have to kind of figure out with getting a product to market. And being able to do that in a scrappy way, I think was something I was looking for. I wanted to kind of grow with the company. I think that was a really good experience for me. I spent 4 years almost at Amazon, and it's like going to college, but in the adult career world of
Yeah.
product management. And you take that and you sprinkle that dust everywhere. And so there were parts of my job where I'm trying to like Amazonify what we're doing in our roles. I'm sure you probably experienced some of that as well. And then there's other parts where you're like, well, that type of process and that type of culture worked really well at Amazon, but it doesn't work here. And I have to think differently now. And so it kind of forced me to start to think about different ways of operating that were not just the very stringent kind of like well-oiled machine ways that Amazon runs.
Yeah, because I think that's a very important learning. When I left Amazon, part of it's like, okay, I've had this foundational understanding. I have the PM frameworks. I understand how to do product management. And very quickly you realize, well, I know how to do product management at Amazon. But as you start to go to these startups, you realize, well, most of these folks have not worked at Amazon. So maybe there isn't this huge writing culture, for example, right? You can't just go into a meeting and be like, hey, everyone, be silent for 15 minutes and read this doc. Like
Right.
that's going to be
Right.
different, right? And so there's those elements that you have to kind of identify, what can I bring that I've learned that is going to be able to be applied here? And then what maybe I might have my own opinions and I still think this is maybe I do think writing culture is strong, but how do I adapt that for the culture that for the company I'm at? And I think that part is not always obvious, in that first move, but I think I've gotten better at as I've kind of moved, across different places.
Yeah, I think the the way that Amazon does product management is very unique in the sense that we learned how to write docs. And I think we've taken that and a lot of companies have adopted that now. But that's not always the best way. And especially now where like fast forward so many years later, docs are actually perhaps too slow. And now you're going into prototyping. PMs are actually creating designs. They're actually creating just small early versions of products themselves. But I imagine that it's different now. I mean, when we were there, you go into a meeting, print the doc out, bring your red pens, and everyone would not speak at all. You would sit there for like 20, 30 minutes. And now with everything being virtual and hybrid, I'm sure people are distracted. People are doing 10 things at the same time. Everyone's commenting on the doc. It's a different culture now.
So remember one of the meetings where one of the leaders thinks someone had stapled it horizontally instead of slanted, and that was that was a big topic of contention.
It was key. You have to make sure you really stapled it the right way. Where you positioned it in the room when people walked in was really important. Where you sat in the room was very important as well. We don't have a concept of that
Yeah.
online now. So I think when people spoke in those meetings, I thought was really interesting. So typically, the more junior folks would tend to share their thoughts first, and then the senior executive that you're really presenting to would share it at the end. I thought that was a good way to give everyone a voice.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, as an introvert, I loved the Amazon culture where oftentimes there was space for junior people to bring up ideas, and even folks that might be, more shy, there was an avenue for that. And I think, to your point, in some of the companies now, it's more about being the first to share an idea
Yeah.
versus driving towards the best ideas. I
Yeah.
think that's another thing that Amazon did really well is because of that writing culture, because everyone's aligned on, hey, everyone in that room has read that doc and has gone through that exercise. Whereas today, that might be shared, but maybe some people read it, some people know a little bit more, so they're going to be the ones speaking. Everyone was on the same page, and I felt this way as, a 22-year-old, 23-year-old. My opinion driven by data was valued,
Right.
right?
Right.
If I was saying something that aligned with data and that was supported by, our customers, that was accepted for the idea. And if I said a poor idea or something that wasn't backed by data, they would challenge me on that. But it was about the idea,
Yeah.
not the person saying it. And I
Yeah.
think that part was an incredible learning. And I try, that's one of the things I try to bring to other companies is really focusing on the idea, not the person who's saying it.
Would love to hear about WeWork, what that was like. You're there at the peak of WeWork where things were really awesome and really chaotic at the same time, for good or for bad. And so would love to hear about navigating that type of environment as a PM. Whereas like Amazon, everything is so structured. You kind of know what to expect. You kind of can look around the corner. You're kind of taking that into WeWork and you're probably, I imagine, doing a lot more of oh my gosh, what's happening tomorrow rather than what's happening, 3 years from now. So just talk through that, like that change in culture and kind of how you navigated that. And maybe we can talk through some fun stories if we get time.
Yeah. Uh, it was really interesting when I made that transition to WeWork. I wanted a little more autonomy. I knew I wanted to move to New York, and so WeWork was an opportunity then where working in office, it was going to bring me to New York. And I think the other piece that was really interesting was the team that I was going to be joining had former Amazon leadership, and that's actually part of what attracted me. Right, there's going to be some of that similarity, but okay, there's going to be something new. And what was interesting is that there were some elements of what we talked about earlier where uh, you can't just blindly apply some of what Amazon does well to any company, right?
Right.
To your point, at a startup like WeWork, when I got there, it was all about growth, growth, growth,
Yeah.
and that was from like a business perspective. So a lot of the focus was like growing the business into all of these different locations.
Yeah.
Um, but if you were to ask, like, why are we doing that versus like, let's focus more of our business on enterprise, or let's focus on really expanding these locations we already have, is more of, well, that's kind of a business decision,
Mm.
focus on the application, which I think is fair feedback.
So
Uh,
you're in like execution mode more, right?
but you're a lot more exact. That's a good way of putting it. You're a lot more in the execution mode versus kind of the strategy.
Yeah.
And I think the strategy is a lot more placed on leadership. And I think that was the fundamental difference between Amazon and WeWork.
Yeah, it's interesting because we were so trained to ask why, take ownership, like ask all the right questions at Amazon, and you kind of go into this environment where you're like, "Whoa, I'm not sure if I can ask some of these questions. I just have to go and execute." So I imagine that was quite a shift.
Yeah. And I think that is something, you know, even now that, with my team or, with just peers of mine, uh, I always encourage them to ask why,
Yeah,
right? That's something that I think is a super important skill just as a product manager that I think was ingrained in us maybe at Amazon,
right.
but is not necessarily obvious to a lot of
Yeah,
folks. You'll notice like there's a ton of really smart people and 99% of the time they are right. So they'll say something and people will just follow it.
right.
And I'm maybe in that 1% where I'll be like, well, why?
Yeah,
I believe you, but why?
yeah, right.
Right. And in that 1% of the time where maybe they didn't fully understand the context, I've now challenged it so that now we're on the same page and we've kind of got everyone aligned. And so I think that that asking of the why, not being able to do that there, at least on a personal level, also was definitely challenging. I think one of the things that I was looking for was still to be in that startup environment, but I had felt like, oh, maybe this was kind of a one-off case where, some of the struggles I may have had with the culture is not true of all startups, but was maybe unique to WeWork. And so when I went to Newzella, that was kind of my test of, okay, let me go to this mission-driven company in the education tech space and do product there.
And like, what got you to even make that change?
Yeah, I think it was the education space has always interested me, even from like a mentorship coaching perspective outside of work. I've always been passionate about education. I think I hadn't thought of that when I went to WeWork. I had indexed more on the learning opportunity and the growth, but
Yep.
not necessarily the mission. And
Yep.
so it was almost a maybe going in the other direction, but still being at a startup with that level of autonomy will be something I really enjoy. And the interesting thing is I definitely enjoyed my time at Newzella, but the education tech space is very interesting. One of the things that motivated me about education is being able to build products for students and teachers. But there was an element of, and maybe this was some for myself, a bit of like expectations versus reality, where the
Yeah.
expectation of you go, I'm going to go to this mission driven company and it's going to, you know, be perfect.
Yeah.
And then you start to realize, kind of like you said earlier about like the grass is more brown.
Brown.
You start to see, well, actually, there are those great elements, but I'm still building for the administrator, and
Right.
and there were yeah, there's a lot of learnings from that.
How did you figure out what was important to you to allow you to then kind of get into that next kind of career jump that took you to where you got to now?
I took some time off between Newzella and Jackpocket and really thought about that exact question. The conclusion I came to were a few things. Number one, I think it is important to find a role that is going to be something that you likely are good at. It's funny, one of the books I read when I took the time off was So Good They Can't Ignore You. And it talks about, competence, autonomy, and community as really the three anchors of, you know, happiness in the workplace. So when we think about competence, like for me, it was okay, I'm not just going to go get any type of product job, but it's a product role that aligns with a skill set that I already have kind of done or
Mhm.
know how to do. Autonomy. At the time, Jackpocket had 4 PMs and they primarily focused on the consumer side of the business. And so I would be the first product manager on the operations and fulfillment side. So in terms of autonomy, okay, there's going to be a single threaded product person that is focused on this area of the business. So I felt like this from a growth and an autonomy perspective was a good opportunity. And then community. I think, culture is a bit taboo now, but it is important, I think, to ensure as much as possible through an interview. It's hard to really gauge that you're going to be working with people that are kind. They are not people that are going to critique you, or it goes back to what I said earlier, not critique you, but they're going to critique the idea and really focus on getting to the best ideas. And I think just genuinely want things to be better. And I think from the community side, again, it's just a handful of interviews, but I did sense that this would be a place that I would jive with.
What are some questions that you asked during the interview process where you got a sense of what that community aspect was at Jackpocket?
I think part of for me, right, that community is like focusing on the idea versus the person. And so asking a question that kind of pulls that out, right? So it's like one thing I tried to focus on was how do you make decisions? Like what is the decision making process like? Can you give me an example of that? And what I'm trying to gather there is that something where it's the loudest person kind of wins? Is it a place where we're extremely data driven? Is it, hey, it's a lot of judgment? Is it, hey, we're going to do it by committee and popularity? And so there's all these different kind of ways that decisions can be made. But understanding that, I think that's a big part of like the culture piece. One other thing that reminded me of is almost asking, the opposite. So it's instead of asking like, what's your favorite thing about the company? Like, what's your least favorite thing about your current company, right? And what I think that usually, and I'll oftentimes ask that to multiple people,
To
and
see if there's like a common thread.
right, and so sometimes maybe there is that common thread, and that's actually the thing that I can maybe help with. Sometimes you start to unpack, okay, this maybe isn't the right culture for me based on
Right.
some of those answers. Sometimes you might, not really get an answer, and maybe that's also speaking to, are people really going to be genuine, and which is part of the culture I'm looking for, is I want people to tell me how I can improve,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so if they're not willing to even answer that and make it seem like everything's perfect, well, maybe that's how it's going to be when I get there.
So you went through all of this interview process. You ultimately got the gig at Jackpocket, and maybe talk through the kind of little bit of the growth that you guys experienced in your size, and then how that ultimately led to the acquisition by DraftKings and what that was like.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, when I got to Jackpocket, I was kind of the first product person on the operations fulfillment side. And so this was an example where, okay, I knew where I could apply some of those Amazon learnings where, okay, the first step was just building foundational product knowledge on that side. Very simply, our customers were internal operations folks in these fulfillment centers
Right.
processing
Right.
tickets. They didn't really know what engineering was working on.
Yep.
Engineering was building stuff that maybe they weren't using, vice versa. Engineering doesn't really know the problems from the operation side. Very simply, creating process where we're all talking to each other, right? Really understanding the pain points. Um, Going into the fulfillment centers, and I visited, I think it was like 6 or 7 in the first 7 or 8 months to really see, okay, what are the differences in different places? But more importantly, to talk to users. So very um, simple, basic kind of product 101 things. But at that time, at that stage, were critical because that was the gap.
So you kind of brought that glue basically.
Exactly. And then from more of the, engineering design side, really creating that product trio and really creating some of the little bit more of like process, but that the startup needed in terms of, okay, here's how we can operate in sprints. Here's, how we might want to ensure we're building against problems and then focusing on us, solutions in a rapid way.
I feel like a lot of people would say that PMs are the glue, right? And they would do like in theory a lot of what you're talking about. But many companies have this kind of situation where these silos kind of start to create. Like, why do you think you were able to figure that out kind of quickly and help make that change?
I think two things. One is empathy, which a lot of people talk about, a lot of product managers talk about, but it really is important, right? Like when I visited those fulfillment centers, I wasn't just talking to users, would say, "Oh, hey, like you're processing these tickets, like can I do that?" But just them seeing like, "Oh, someone's coming here and they're not just asking me to do something or asking me about problems, but they're trying to feel the pain themselves." I think that's so important and so rare. Like there's plenty of times where, even when I would do some of the team visits where I'd have to encourage folks to, hey, like let's feel the pain ourselves.
Yeah.
And I think that part is really important because it builds those relationships. And then I think it's the second part's the communication, which is, and you kind of alluded to it, like bridging that gap or like that context. I don't even know the right kind of terminology,
Yeah.
but there's there's a lot of times where people are talking about the same thing, but they're not on the same page.
Right. Right.
I think one of my core skills that I've learned over time is being able to identify that. I think it goes back to some of that curiosity. Ask the right question to then almost challenge folks to then realize that they're not on the same page. Now we're aligned and then kind of moving forward. And that's an underrated skill, I think. So I think that part, and communication's a broad way to say it, but I think that part was really important where sometimes engineering may have thought they were solving uh, the right problem. They were solving a problem for operations, but maybe not what operations was actually saying. They were maybe solving exactly what they said, but operations really meant something else.
Yeah.
And being able to bridge that, and you and I have talked about this, like that. I don't know if there's like a good way to frame that, but that is such a core skill.
And it's hard to test, right? We talked about that. Like, how do you test that in an interview, right? Like, how do you gauge whether someone is capable of doing that? It's very, very difficult. I think like maybe putting them in a simulation is maybe one example, but it's hard. I remember I think DoorDash earlier on before they got really big had a program where they may still have it where they encouraged and almost potentially required in some roles for you to actually be a dasher and go out and do the delivery yourself. I imagine Uber had something similar back in the day. And I think that these types of companies, especially where there's like a physical component to your software product, getting empathy there, I think goes a long way because then you ultimately can really bridge that gap between you being kind of up here in the software and down to where the customer is actually touching your product.
Yeah, I think at Amazon, that reminds me, like, they had when I was on the last mile team, I did 2 of those visits. So one was in, I guess just outside of Seattle where they're delivering in a truck. And so I rode with them the whole day and
Oh yeah.
seeing
Mhm.
seeing all of that, right? Like, and you start to realize certain things that you just get empathy for. They get blocked by, a fence or like a code, like, oh, there's a dog that they have to work around. Oh, the routing system has taken them to a place where this isn't even an apartment. And you start, as a customer, you're like, oh, how did Amazon,
That's true
miss the
that. Okay.
package or whatever? And you start to see there's like very real reasons and maybe things as an employee, like, oh, my team can help fix. And so, yeah, you really, you learn like it's not just the empathy for like the job itself, but just like the things that you don't really realize. In the Jackpocket fulfillment center, it wasn't even about the processing of tickets, but they're doing all these things where, oh, like the toilet goes out and now they have to go handle that and call like the plumbing company or, oh, uh, you know, the sink, there's something there or there's a people problem. And like, you don't see that from your computer.
Yeah.
And you and I have talked about like the parts of like in-person work that's really
Right.
beneficial, but this highlights that of just being there with your customer. It's so important.
Yeah, I I had a similar experience at Amazon as well, where I was on the marketplace side, so we worked a lot with their customer service teams. They had the whole program where you could shadow a customer service representative, and that ever since I did that, still to this day, I have so much empathy for customer service because I understand the processes that they use internally. I've seen how a lot of the time the products that are built for them are usually lower priority than the products that are built for the end customer. So like you can yell at them all you want on the phone as a consumer, but they probably don't have the power to do a lot of things that you think they do. And so just building that empathy allowed us to figure out, hey, like if we want to solve this for Nikil as our end consumer who's going to have a problem with their order on Amazon, we need to also solve it for the Amazon customer service associate.
Yeah, totally. I think there's an interesting dynamic, right? Where yes, the fulfillment center employees are our customers, but at the end of the day, they are processing tickets that are then for the end customer,
Right.
right? And so ultimately, even from thinking about product, the software we're building or the technology that we're building in the fulfillment centers are ultimately, yes, to help our operations customers, but in service of our end customers.
Exactly.
And so thinking about that, and that's honestly why I love some of the internal products and have worked so closely with internal customers. It's like you have to think about both, but then also from a feedback perspective, it's a dream as a product manager. You know, I've worked on these consumer products where, you set up user research time, you set up, like it's hard to get people on, it's hard to get
Yep.
that feedback. It's hard to get, meaningful feedback. A lot of times what is being described, going back to that context bridging, is not the core problem, right? You might interpret it one way, but then when you actually see it or do it firsthand or observe it, you start to unpack it and it's like, oh, this is the real problem.
Yeah.
And there is a beauty of that with internal customers where you can feel the pain yourself. And then it's like, okay, now I'm motivated myself to go solve it.
All right. So you did a lot of 0 to 1 also at Jackpockets. I imagine that's completely different than doing something from the ground up at a bigger company.
Yeah. So part of what I was mentioning earlier, right? Doing some of the foundational stuff with our existing draw business, but really getting our teams communicating with each other. And then there was this real opportunity to bring a new vertical to the lottery space. We had supported these draw tickets, Mega Millions, Powerball, those types of games, but had never really ventured into the scratcher business.
And maybe just for the sake of people listening, like explain a little bit about what Jackpocket is.
Yeah, yeah. So as I mentioned, it's a lottery courier service. And so what that means is that ultimately the problem that we're solving is giving you the convenience to buy a lottery ticket in your house rather than having to go to a convenience store. And we are actually still physically processing and fulfilling that ticket, but we're giving you a digital experience. So you as a customer, Zakir, you go on Jackpocket, you'll pay a little bit of a convenience fee, but you order um, a ticket, and we'll talk about the straw ticket. So you order a Mega Millions ticket. Now in the fulfillment center, we are going to have to purchase that ticket for you. So we have these fulfillment centers that have technology to optimize that at scale. And then once
Because everything's still physical, right? Yeah.
everything's still physical because we still have to abide by the law. There's no, API we're hooking into. So we still have this lottery terminal, right? And so ultimately, we kind of do this fulfillment process and we'll give you that ticket in the app. And then if the benefit is if you win a small amount, so typically that's under like $600, you're just going to get credited immediately, which is kind of nice versus in the real world, you'd have to go to the
Cash it
lottery
out.
office. Of course, if it's a big winner, which is usually above $600, then we will send you or you can pick up the physical ticket and then redeem that at um, you know, a lottery provider. And so I think,
Do you send that in the mail? Like, how does someone get that physical ticket then? Because they never probably saw it in the beginning, right? It's all digital.
yeah. So exactly. So they don't see that in the beginning, but like, yeah, if it's a larger winner, depending on the amount of risk,
I see.
basically, we'll either send it to you or have you pick it up. Like if you're winning over a certain amount, which kind of varies by state, we would ensure that you come into our fulfillment center and pick up that ticket.
Oh, so you come to a Jackpocket fulfillment center and pick that up.
Yeah, and
Okay.
so we kind of have this big winner experience that we
Oh, that's
we
cool.
usually try to give to folks where, yeah, if they want, they can take a picture. We can kind of hear about the experience. It's cool. I've spoken to a few of those, and that's as a product person, it's really exciting because one, sometimes you see like the change in life that
Yeah.
folks have.
That's like the ultimate happy path
Y-
product experience.
Yeah, yeah, and then sometimes there's like this belief. It's like, oh, I didn't even believe, like I wasn't sure if this is real. Like this is amazing, and so you really get that um incredible customer win and get to see that firsthand. So ultimately, we had that process down for fulfillment on the draw side, and now we saw this opportunity from the scratch off business, and we started with one state, and I still remember we had this kind of hack week where we went to Santa Barbara and we spent a week really thinking out how are we going to do this. And for me, it was really exciting. A super small team. Uh, we had 4 engineers and myself. and one designer, and focused end to end on everything, right? And so we had to think about not just like the end experience for the customer, right? We also had to think about what that back end service looked like, and then how is that going to communicate to the technology and the actual physical operations center that's
Mhm.
going to process these tickets. Because in the world, and the the additional hurdle with these scratch off tickets is actually the physical piece of we are going to be scratching off tickets,
Yeah. Right.
and how do you do that at
Yeah.
scale, right? Versus in the draw world, printing a ticket from a lottery terminal, sure, there's challenges, but um, ultimately there's an ability to reprint. Whereas the scratch off ticket, there's one scratch off ticket, right? That's with any digital product for a physical asset. It's like there's always that question of like, oh, is this real, right? Is this trustworthy? And so we really did have to solve that um, from a scratch off perspective. But yeah, we want, I think, just to get from an MVP perspective and on the product side, being able to think about that product end to end, and really on that hack week was brainstorming, okay, we want to do scratch offs, like how would we do it? So thinking about organizing it from a fulfillment perspective,
Yep.
then thinking about how that experience would be for the end customer. And I would say it really taught me a few things. I think team chemistry is so underrated,
Mm.
and you don't realize it until you're in it. When when I was working with
Like, are you talking about your tight knit team that you had of the like the 5, 6 of you, or are you talking about broadening that for the larger organization?
I'm talking about the 5 to 6 of us, and so, some of our strengths would be others' gaps, but then being able to balance that out. Sometimes we would in certain things, we would all be on the same page. You say something and everyone understands. So to that earlier point about the context bridging, there wasn't a lot of that because everyone was on the same page. If you were saying something, they all understood that and how to drive it. As a product person, it gave you the luxury where sometimes it wasn't about writing the strongest requirements.
Right.
It was about setting the business context of what we want to do. And those engineers would know when to ask the right
They're
questions,
empowered. Yep.
right? They're empowered. So they feel empowered to build and design things. They feel empowered to be like, hey, Nikhil, you said this, but I actually think we want to do this. And that was kind of baked into it. Could you do that with anybody? No, you know that, right? That would only work with certain
Yep.
people. So I think so much of product is as you know, it's personality and also like psychology.
Yeah.
How are certain people going to work best? And you want to optimize for that. As a product person, ultimately, you are going to, you know, have to adapt a little bit, and you're going to have to pick up the pieces of the things that aren't really clearly owned. But if you can adapt to your people, and if you can create that tight knit bound, which I think going back to the chemistry really was there, you've really become that glue,
Yeah.
right? You can't just put process to put process, but for certain people, that process is necessary, and index on that for those people. And then for certain people, oh, maybe it's a little bit less, but you can empower them in a different way. And I think that was probably the biggest learning I had.
Yeah. I think that's a very unique perspective on who you need to be the glue of. Where I feel like the reason why you probably were very successful in that situation was because you were the glue with your engineering team. And I think a lot of the time, like PMs will forget, oh yeah, I need to be the glue for like my manager or my leader or like my sales partner or my marketing partner. And they forget about the engineering team. And then this becomes there's this pattern of like PMs throwing things over the wall to the engineering team, engineering being upset with PM. And like, I strongly believe, and I know we've talked about this, your engineering team is everything. Like if you, if your strongest relationship as a PM is not with your engineering team, then you're in trouble. And I think that you really need to build that bond, and that, like you said, like you unlock that chemistry, and it probably, 2, 3, 4x your ability to as a joint team to build a successful product, to actually like really embed yourselves as a unit in like what you're building, what the impact is, and why. And I think that that's just really important for people to understand.
Yeah, it's so true. That I'm so glad you mentioned that because it was that everyone felt motivated. Like I still remember there really was no pressure on us from a timeline perspective. There really was which is interesting because a lot of times people feel like, oh, with these MVPs, it's like there's this defined timeline, and then if you rush towards it, that's actually going to be, the fastest output. But what was interesting here was that there was none of that. And in fact, I still remember we had a conversation where we worked together to define that. And it was for what it was, we delivered this in 5 months, which was very quick in terms of what we had to do overall end to end. Where a lot of the reason we hadn't done it in the past was people feared this might be, more of a year long investment. And the team was invested in it. I still remember the team was like, oh, yeah, no, we said this date, we're going to go do it. And I remember as we started getting closer to that, having, 12 a.m. conversations. And again, it wasn't that I felt like that was work or my team felt like that was work.
Yeah.
We were enjoying it. It was like talking with friends, and it was like, oh, we're going to solve this problem. We were all motivated about solving a problem, and we all felt like excited about it. It felt like play. And I know that might sound cliche, and even I may have thought that before I had this experience, but it was real. It was just a genuine interest. There wasn't these boundaries of like work life balance. And I remember after that, folks were like, oh, you guys really need to work less, or like, oh, hey, there needs to be better boundaries set. And us as a team, we're like, no, we wanted that. That was a genuine interest. And
Yeah.
yes, that isn't sustainable for sure. And we changed those patterns, but it was infectious. And I think when you for engineering, when you can build that feeling, it makes a world of a difference.
Totally
It really
unlocks
does.
like a whole next level. So then you guys went through that experience. You launched this product in 5 months. I imagine it wasn't too long after that where acquisition talks started to happen. Like, how did you navigate that? Just going back into a bigger company again?
The culture, as I mentioned earlier, is a big part of why I came to Jackpocket, right? And the biggest difference when you kind of from the acquisition perspective is, at Jackpocket you have this tight knit culture. You kind of know everybody. It's like, and you know how important this is from a product perspective, being resourceful and being able to build those relationships.
Yep.
That's again one of those underrated soft skills that you don't necessarily realize until you're in the product role, but that's so important. And so post acquisition, or even going through the acquisition, it's about, it kind of does feel like a new company, and you have to learn who those people are, right? People have different roles. And so, like, you personally might grow. You might actually now have less of a scope because it's a larger company. You might be going into like a slightly different vertical because, there's just lottery is one part of this larger area. So I think one of the things I had to be very intentional about is who are those people and building those relationships again. Um, I was fortunate, in terms of the fulfillment product, that was very unique from a Jackpocket perspective versus what DraftKings does, right?
Right.
Most of DraftKings doesn't really have this
It's all
physical
online, yeah.
operations part. And so my domain was a little bit more uh, defined. And so therefore, I was really in my new role at DraftKings still going to be focused on the same area with lottery, but that wasn't true of everyone at Jackpocket.
Right.
And so a lot of other folks think they had to think about how are they transitioning within their domain and how to get comfortable with that. For me, it was more about, okay, now there's a little bit more process and in some ways good process, right? But you have to learn what that is
Right.
and so that transition can be challenging, right? Now there's not just one person that does this, but there's a process to, you know, do this certain thing. Whereas, at Amazon, we knew about that, right? Like, by maybe getting permissions to something,
Right.
right? And those processes are needed at that scale, but it is different, right? And so just having to adjust to things like that. They might seem small, but it's part of the difference between, being at a small company versus a large company. And obviously there's differences in terms of not just process, but also like strategy and decision making and things like that. But even some of those things that maybe you and I, because we had been at a company like Amazon, were already familiar with, um, can be a change in terms of, again, that word culture, right?
All right, let's transition to our final topic here around something we're both very passionate about. And so you've been kind of uh, mentoring folks for longer than I have as well. And so we'd love to get your perspective on why you do it, first of all, like what gets you motivated to kind of want to mentor others, what you've done as a mentor, kind of like what types of things you've done to kind of put yourself out there. And then we can kind of share some tips on things you've seen that you've tried to coach others on.
Yeah. I think, in terms of why I do it, there's a couple of reasons. One is that I genuinely enjoy it. And there is a piece of when you are uh, speaking with others, you can call it mentorship, you can call it coaching. There is learning for both people. And it goes back to that thing that I mentioned earlier about empathy. You build this bond with folks. And I think it's really important in mentoring to realize that, especially as a mentee, oftentimes, that what you're experiencing, you're not alone. One of the reasons I think I enjoy mentoring and that I have found to be successful at it is that I'm not necessarily a person that knows everything. I'm actually, as we've talked a lot about, like I've struggled a lot, right? If someone in the product world is talking about, feeling stuck, I'm like, trust me, I know that. The college student that reaches out and says, "Hey, I don't really know what I want to do." Been there, I know exactly what you're talking about. When I started, in high school, like I started more on like tutoring, and I was never the person that you know just always knew the answer, right? I was kind of the person that I would have to go through that example and like really learn it and then
Asking
foundational.
clarifying questions,
Yeah, yeah,
bring
kind of.
your product perspective into
I
things.
guess I was kind of the product person even when I didn't realize it. Uh, but then you start to realize that that's sometimes the guidance that is missing. Yeah, in the tutoring world, certain students might struggle in a
Yeah.
certain way. And I think that was where I used to connect really well with students because I was like, I was that person that struggled. Oh, when you're here, like I know exactly that struggle. Okay, here's how to think about it. And then relating it in their language, I think is so important. Finding what their interests are and then being able to speak to that. I love doing analogies where it relates to what they are good at. So now they are taking something that they're good at and now applying something that maybe they're struggling with, but in that kind of concept.
Yeah. I think that it's that thread that you seem to have across a lot of these experiences, even tying back to your actual job, which is like this empathy piece, because you have to have that to be a great coach. And I think you understanding even you're also being the glue, right? You're like, hey, students, here's what you're facing. And here are the gaps that teachers and professors may not be able to help them with. And I think that's super important. And I think bringing that perspective is helpful because a lot of times, especially younger folks, don't have the exposure to kind of what that could be.
Um, I do a lot of like student mentorship as well as, from the product side. And I'm always very transparent of I do a lot of this because I'm going to learn from you,
Yeah.
right? And I also want to learn from you. I can only offer what I experienced in a lot of ways. I'm not going to just tell you blanket things. But then I also want to understand where you're coming from so that if there are things where, oh, I've gone through that same thing, here's how I approached it. And maybe sometimes had pitfalls, and here's how I approached it and sometimes got through it.
Yeah. I think that it's an aspect of pattern matching ultimately. So you're building this kind of portfolio of patterns that you're then able to then help others with. And I think if you ask the right questions, which you talked about, you'll figure out what those patterns are. And then once you figure out what those patterns are, you can help your mentee. And so I think that's a really powerful aspect of coaching that I also like. I think there's there's helping people feel motivated and in their own kind of intrinsic ways and figuring out how to unlock that out of someone gives me a lot of joy. And I think that helps me feel like I can kind of bring that energy that you need and help you find that in yourself.
For me, it's like I've always said one of my even personal goals, right, is to raise the aspirations of the people around me. And in that way, and even when we talk, right, there's an element of this imposter syndrome or this self doubt. And sometimes you just need that other person or someone else to bring that out of you, right?
Right.
There's times where, I mean, both you and I, we're very experienced product people. We still come to each other and with sometimes what some others might say is a very simple product pro,
Right.
right? And oftentimes our approach is probably, in the right direction, but we need that guidance or that assurance of like, yeah, this is the right thing. Or, oh, hey, sometimes you need that person to kind of tell you, hey, you know what? Actually, think about it this way. And I think that's so important to have that because um, we all have those doubts, and we may not be open about it, but it's really important to have someone that can kind of push you. And if I can be that person again, just to sometimes not even give advice, but to hear those doubts and help you feel heard, and then also bring out that confidence in you that you already have it. Um, it that feeling is very powerful.
We'll end it there. And thanks again, Nikhil. It's so awesome to have you on the show.
Thanks for having me. Zach.
And we're going to kick off, hopefully, what's a really exciting podcast series with more guests to come.